Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 3rd, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. This show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as we keep making episodes. Hopefully the next 500, because we are on episode 575 already. That's bananas. So as always at the top of the show, I just want to give a shout out to the top patrons. You guys are amazing. And you include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Joseph Lamore, Anu Badavaj, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. All right, let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Eram Alam, and she is an associate professor of the history of science in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University. She specializes in the history of medicine and particularly emphasizes on globalization, race, migration, and health during the 20th century. She's currently working on a project about medical tourism, so I'm really excited to try and have her back to talk about that. But she actually has a new book that just dropped. The title is The Care of Foreigners: How Immigrant Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare. It's a fascinating conversation, so without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Eram Alam. Well, Eram, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too. What a fascinating topic. So you have a new book called The Care of Foreigners: How Immigration Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare. And of course, we're going to get all kind of into your background, but right at the top, I want to say that you are an academic. You're a professor in the history of science. And is this your first book? Like, you've obviously written a lot, but has it mostly been academic work up till now?
Yeah, so this is my first book. It turns out these things take a long time to produce.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Talking about the process with so many authors, I think selfishly, because deep down in my psyche, I know that I want to tackle something like this at some point, but goodness, does it feel daunting.
Yeah, make sure you take about 5 years of your life. Make sure you can
Yeah.
chunk that time.
And so I'm curious then, this topic, this idea of, immigrant physicians in the US, is this something that has been a through line in your research? Is it something that dates back to graduate school for you? Like, where did this, I don't know, it's such a complex question, but the ebbs and the flows of your research interest, has this always been kind of central?
No.
Oh, okay.
So I can answer this. And I went into graduate school thinking I would work on something very, very different than this. I was interested in health disparities research,
Mhm.
and especially in urban cities in the United States. And I just kept asking this question that felt like it wasn't answered, of who's actually providing care in these spaces, because I would get all of this, read this literature that showed that a health disparity existed.
Mhm.
And I said, okay, great. But then what do I do? How do I understand a component of how this is coming to be? And so this is where this question of labor really became one that I thought was underexplored and really important to this whole, of the emergence of the health disparities work. And then on a very personal note, I am of South Asian descent. My parents came from India in 1970, and they didn't come as physicians. My dad was an engineer. And every time I'd go to the doctor, I'd always get asked if I was also a physician.
Mm.
And I'd say no. And then later on, it became this funny thing while I was in graduate school where it'd say, oh no, I'm training to become a PhD, a poor, hungry doctor instead of an MD, a money doctor, So, but it was this thing of like this expectation that if you have some kind of fluency in this medical scientific space, that therefore you must be part of the medical establishment. And so those kinds of things, just were sitting in my head and kind of percolating of why is that such an easy ask for people.
Hmm.
And it turns out that part of it was because of this history that I write, that, there was a very deliberate um, correlation between a certain ethnicity and a professional identity. And so I think people over time were picking up on that.
Oh, yeah, and I think it's become, as you mentioned, a stereotype, and a stereotype that is, sometimes stereotypes develop because of people's personal experiences. I think anybody listening to the show who lives in the United States has probably uh, been a patient of Indian doctors. I have many, many friends who are Indian who are healthcare providers, and so I'm curious how that sort of came to be. But before we dive into the book, I want to know a little bit more about you, because the history of science is such a fascinating topic to me. And it's one that obviously exists. I'm lucky enough to know that it exists because I also am a poor, hungry doctor. As of late, actually, it's a relatively new development.
Congratulations. Welcome
Thank
to
you.
the club.
Thank you. And so, I was very lucky in studying both psychology and neuroscience to take a lot of like history and systems courses and learn about the background of these areas of my
Mhm.
research and clinical inquiry. And I love the history and systems of, psychology, of medicine, of science. And I think most scientists know that science is a process, and we have to learn about science
Mhm.
by learning how we know what we know, not just what we know. But I wonder if there is a disconnect with the general public that, science or medicine is just the information, it's not the process.
Yeah, I think there definitely is. And there is a way that science has constructed itself that has been challenged as of late, I think in pretty aggressive ways, but previously as if it is a reflection of the natural world, that it
Mhm.
is just about excavating the truth from nature, and that this is some kind of objective, neutral, apolitical truth that exists out there. And
Right.
scientists are doing, yeah, just that work of uncovering, when in fact, the whole entire enterprise is interpretive. There's no such thing as, yes, gravity exists, but until we give it a name, until we start to make decisions around what it means, what its speed is, how it moves, how we're going to think about it, how we're going to put it in equations, how are we going to construct planes so that they can resist gravity. That thing is not actually is meaningless. That we
Mhm.
have to, in fact, as humans, put meaning on all of that stuff. And so that's what the history of science does, is it tries to force us to pay attention to the fact that all of scientific knowledge, or knowledge in general, is an interpretive act. And at different moments, different things like politics and economics and just social forces and culture and capital come to turn it into the things that we recognize today.
Ugh, it's such an important point. It's one that excites me because I think it it's so well known, but it's also very rejected in a lot of circles. And I see so much parallel in my clinical work with patients. Like we use the term a lot in psychology, constructivism, right? Like there
Mhm.
is reality. Of course, there is reality out there, but we construct our understanding of reality and our kind of narratives and our versions. And
Mhm.
and my job as a psychologist is not to bring patients to my constructed reality. It's to try and enter into theirs and operate within their frame, which is challenging, but I think it's also a beautiful exercise in empathy. And I wondered if we all sort of recognized this constructivist view, this interpretive, as you mentioned, sort of hermeneutic when we're reading and when we're
Mhm.
engaging with people. Gosh, how much more empathy would there be in the world?
I mean, a lot more, and we need a lot more of it. So keep doing the work that you're doing.
And you as well, because I think the important thing here, just to reiterate, is that there is no such thing as a pure scientific endeavor. And there's no such thing as like pure policy or
Mhm.
unfettered medicine, for example. It's all occurring through the lenses, as you mentioned, of the people at the helm, which often is an exercise in power. So it's why we have healthcare disparities. It's one of the main reasons. It's why, we talk on this show a lot about the differences between socioeconomic statuses or gender or race ethnicity when it comes to not just access to healthcare, but how healthcare is provided, how women's pain, for example, is interpreted. And it's interesting that, kind of to bring it full circle, you mentioned that a lot of the research and a lot of the conversations are about the recipients of the healthcare and not necessarily about those who are on those front lines. And so it's so interesting that you chose that tack. Do you remember what first kind of perked your ears up to say, wait, I want to talk about the people getting the training, the people delivering these services in these areas?
Yeah, so, in my kind of joking setup of the situation of these assumptions that were made about me, um, I also realized that as I was doing my work in the history of medicine, that in so much of the literature that I was reading, which was about the longer history of American medicine and how it came to be, that there was this huge gap. And so I was seeing this disconnect that on the one hand, there's this familiarity such that I go to the doctor, people just assume that I'm a doctor. On the other hand, in this other more academic domain, in this historical register, there's no work that has really been done on this cohort of people.
Mm,
And then I started to dig into this and wonder why. And also because where I end in the book is with there's so many popular media representations of this configuration of person. So from the Sanjay Gupta to Vivek Murthy to Deepak Chopra, et cetera. So it's like there's this disconnect that's happening between what people are seeing and the expectations that they have in their
mhm.
everyday lives and the research that's there. And so then I started digging into it and realized that for the last 60 years, a quarter, and if not more, and in certain places, anywhere from 50 to 100% of the physicians that are working in this country are immigrant physicians. They're physicians that were born elsewhere and that have come here to provide care to America's most marginalized communities throughout the country.
Wow. And obviously, I think we'll get there hopefully towards the end of our conversation. And you are by no means an expert on the current administration's policy attempts, but obviously there are some real intentional pushes to reduce and even reverse a lot of our immigration policy in this country through like pretty brutal means. And so it's going to be interesting to even speculate and talk about how that is going to affect the landscape. But before we talk about the future, let's continue this journey down the past. I'm curious, and this is kind of a broader question that's maybe not fully covered here. But when we think about medicine in America, healthcare, physicians, for example. Around when did we start to see? I'm sure it was a slow, steady process, but around when did we start to see what we would call kind of modern medicine? We all have the idea of like the barber surgeon, right, from the
Mhm,
past that was like maybe not as
mhm.
evidence based. But when did we start to see sort of science based medicine or early attempts where you had to have gone through training and had the degree, and there were like some amount of regulation, things that we might call doctors today.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that question because I think people often assume that this category of person is ahistorical and just
Mm,
has existed always in the version that we know. But it wasn't until about the 1880s, maybe the 1890s, where we even started to see this expansion of what medical education should be. So there were all these debates about whether you should actually have 2 years of school. Should it be didactic lectures? Should it be a few years of clinical training? At other times, people were able to receive a medical degree if they had done 4 months of an apprenticeship. So, just to
wow.
say that in the 1880s and the 1890s, there was a huge range of people who called themselves doctors and the routes through which they were able to do so. And
Hmm.
all of it was fair game. there
Wow.
was there was not really a mechanism to police. But then there was these elite medical men, as I call them in a lot of my teaching and stuff, who went to Europe and they saw that, okay, wait, Europe is way more advanced than the United States. They actually have a set curriculum for what it means to be a physician. It's related to laboratory sciences as well. And they actually have a physical clinic or a hospital. And so there was this construction of this kind of triad, which now I think for us looks more like an academic medical center where you have a clinic and a medical school and a lab set up in the same space. But the US didn't have that at all. So in Europe, they had the system. These wealthy men went to Europe, received their education there. They came back and they said, the US is so backwards. We need to start instituting some kind of reform to streamline this whole process because if somebody who has received 4 months of training in a classroom versus somebody who's received 4 years of training in Europe can both call themselves a doctor, then A, how is a patient supposed to know
Yeah.
who is what? And B, like, doesn't it dilute the integrity of the person who's done the work for 4 years to be on
Yeah.
the same level as the person who's done 4 months? So finally, in about 1910, these men came together and they commissioned this person named Abraham Flexner to produce this report. And it's this really famous report in the history of medicine called the Flexner Report. And he did a survey of all of the hospitals in the United States and all of the medical schools in the United States. And he basically said, okay, this one is not up to the standard. This one is up to the standard. This is what this medical school has to do in order to get to that standard. And the standard was to have at least 2 to 3 years of biomedical education, to have clinical practice in addition to that, to have laboratory based sciences as part of the curriculum. But the consequence
Hmm.
of this was that only very wealthy medical schools were able to reform such that they were
Mm,
aligned with these recommendations. So, especially at this time, remember we're in the period of Jim Crow, Black medical schools were essentially forced to close. So, there were only two of them that were actually able to follow this new set of guidelines. And the consequence was that the number of Black physicians was heavily reduced. The number of
yeah.
women who were able to practice it was very few to begin with, but even the few medical schools that were available to women, those were forced to close. So the net effect produced through this reform and through this regulation was this really kind of coherence of the profession that looked a certain way in terms of education, but also looked a certain way in terms of demographics. It was a white, male, wealthy, elite group who were actually able now to access medical education.
Mm. You know, it's interesting. I think about so much of our perception of the past is colored, I guess you could say, or informed by popular culture. And I keep coming back in my head whenever you're talking about this to the visual imagery from that show, The Nick. I don't know if you ever watched it
I
about this
haven't.
Oh my gosh, I highly recommend it. It's about this fictional hospital in New York in the year 1900. That's when it starts, at least with
Mm.
Clive Owen and the Knickerbocker Hospital. And it really just digs deep into. I remember, like, in the first episode, I think the hospital is getting electricity, and
Mhm.
a lot of it takes place in the surgical theater, but they also have their laboratories. And again, it's all white men, but it shows the nursing staff. It shows a lot of the black staff of the hospital is the support staff.
Mhm.
And there's a character who actually does train in Paris who comes over. It's a Soderbergh show, and I thought it was riveting. It's really, really gory, but I'd be curious if you did watch it, how accurate you felt some of the references are, like the way that the private ambulance services worked and the way that people were sort of making money on the side, how a lot of things weren't regulated and doctors were trying out new surgical techniques on, poor patients. And it's a fascinating glimpse into this sort of Wild West era where all of those as you mentioned, sort of like regulatory things were just passed, but it was still a little like, pre-modern, we could say. It was like the early modern medicine.
Yeah, I mean, from the things that you have just mentioned, it sounds like it's pretty historically accurate. There were no real therapeutics during
Mm.
that period of time. And the major things that came on the scene were probably insulin in 1922, but things like penicillin and stuff, antibiotics, didn't show up until 1947. So people were
Wow.
just doing all sorts of experiments to figure out what worked. And, I put that in air quotes because that was really an open question. So you had this funny thing where people are starting to develop technology in the hospital. You had the x-ray, but patients were scared about the x-ray. What is this that you can see inside of somebody's body? This is
Yeah.
bonkers.
Yeah.
This is devil work that's happening here. And yeah, so there were just a few things that they could do, and tests and technology. You could, test urine, but you have nothing to do with the results of the test of the urine. So they just kept
Right.
doing it over and over and over again.
Wow. And there's, of course, surgical techniques, but people just kept
Yeah.
dying all the time, which was terrifying. And they didn't really have anesthesia, did they? Maybe they had ether at that point and alcohol.
Yeah, so anesthesia started to emerge on the scene that was being used during that time. But again, I mean, it was probably much, much more common than even a few years before. But people were also afraid of this mini death.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not a it's a scary thing, to be
I'm still afraid
completely.
of it, to be honest.
Yeah. With good
Definitely.
reason.
I know.
So
It's like, oh gosh, the first time I ever went I mean, I've only really been under twice, but the first time I went under, I remember telling my anesthesiologist, "I am really nervous today. I'm very terrified." And he was like, "That is normal.
yeah.
That's a thing." But yeah, I mean, gosh, I'm so glad we live when we live. But also, living when we live is the culmination of all the things that came before us. So we sort of talked about the beginnings, but I want to talk about the beginnings of your specific area of focus here. How did it come to be? And I'm sure that's a much more complicated question than the way I'm asking it. How did it come to be that, like, almost 1 in 4 doctors in the US right now was foreign born, and so many of them come from South Asia?
Yeah. So that prehistory that we just set up, one of the consequences of it was that there was a very limited number of people who could actually call themselves physicians. So, in addition, during that period of time, things like licensing and state licensing and regulation developed as a thing.
Hmm.
And so, all of these kinds of bureaucratic mechanisms of limiting, doing educational reform, licensure reform, all of this made sure that the profession remained pretty small.
Mm.
And the result of that is, whenever we have something that's scarce, we value it more. And
Yeah.
there was a intentional scarcity that was produced around the profession in order to maintain authority, prestige, etc., and to really just cohere that in this group of people that were called physicians. So fast forward a little bit. that the number of people that are entering into the labor force who have graduated from these medical schools now after all of this reform period is pretty stable and pretty consistent. Post World War II, there's a huge population boom.
Hmm.
All of the people are coming back, they're having children, and their high children are high users of healthcare. Follow that with generally in 1964, the Civil Rights Act. One of the key pieces of that legislation is that hospitals are forced to desegregate. But also,
Mm.
just in addition, there's this political awareness that health is a human right and should be a human right. And so you have all of these civil rights groups that are understanding what they're doing through that lens as well. So we see this with the Black Panthers, who really, really focused a lot on health with an understanding that this is a site of extreme, important, political activism. We
Hmm.
have the rise of the women's movement. They also are asserting themselves in this space and asserting their rights to access to a certain kind of healthcare. Okay, so this is kind of this political activism. We have the population boom. And then finally in 1965, in July of 1965, Medicare and Medicaid passed.
Mm.
So just to refresh for your audience, Medicare is over 65. The government subsidizes insurance, and Medicaid is for people that are low income, also under federally subsidized health insurance. So overnight, you have anywhere from 20 to 25 million people who are now able to access care.
Wow.
And so all of these changes were coming together to really drive up medical demand. But then the history that we just talked about, the supply of physicians continues to be pretty stable, and it's
Hmm.
not able to meet that demand.
And so what do they do, right?
Yeah, I know. So I got you at the edge of your seat.
Yeah, I know. Like, what do we do?
Like,
So really, there was a period where there were all these people seeking care, and there were just like really long wait times, or they just couldn't get access.
yeah, yeah, it was,
Yeah.
and that a lot of that had to also do with racial segregation. So one of the key pieces of legislation in the Civil Rights Act that was so important for healthcare was that hospitals were forced to desegregate if they wanted any federal
Oh,
reimbursements.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that was really key because, especially of Medicare and Medicaid coming just a few months after that, it really incentivized desegregation and increased access to care for people. So
Hmm.
we have all of that set up. And then we're in this October 3rd, 1965 moment where the piece of legislation that I really delve into, which is the Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act, gets passed. So, this is an interesting piece of legislation because the whole outward argument around it that Lyndon B. Johnson, he said this when he was signing this bill, that this was all about the US's geopolitical position in the world.
Hmm.
And that this immigration legislation was actually not going to change so much of the day to day quotidian practices of life in the United States. So he was trying to persuade the American public that as the United States in this Cold War period was emerging as the global superpower, it had this really closed, isolationist, nativist piece of immigration legislation that was still on the books. That was the most
Hmm.
comprehensive piece of legislation. So it was this 1924 Act, which had two components. One was called the Asian Exclusion Act, and it did exactly that. It disallowed pretty much any immigration from Asia and Africa. And the second was a National Origins Act, which had a very limited quota for people from Southern and Eastern Europe.
Was this like a function of the war? Like, what? Where did this come from?
The 1924 Act, it was a function of a lot of xenophobia during that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a function of the US wanting to protect itself, feeling like it didn't want to get involved in the European wars,
Hmm.
that this was a way of making sure that the nation remained homogenous in the face of increasing immigration, and these other kinds of threats. So,
Yeah, I guess I think a lot of people often forget, and I mean, I did for a second too, that sort of a lot of the eugenic and like deeply racial,
yes,
the things that we think of as being German born only a couple decades later were really brewing in the United States and were kind of imported to Germany at that time. Like a lot of policy was actually informed by what was happening here in the US.
100%.
Yeah, yeah.
These eugenicists were writing that policy that was directly going to Germany just 10, 15 years
Oof.
later. So, yeah, so the US is not this open place. But now,
Mhm.
fast forward into this Cold War era where the US is trying to promote this liberal democracy. It's trying to promote capitalism in the face of communist encroachment. And yet, it has this immigration legislation on the books. And the Cold War is being fought in these newly emergent post colonial African and Asian nations.
Mm.
And so immigration becomes this really important foreign policy tool to tell these new countries, we are your friends. We want you to come into the capitalist fold. And look, this is what we're doing is that we want even the people from your country to come to our country through these immigration mechanisms because these kinds of political ideologies, they become embodied in people. And so the idea was that if you can circulate these people, then you can circulate this ideology as well.
Mm, mhm.
And so that was really the function of this piece of legislation outwardly, that this is just correcting this political wrong, as LBJ called it, and it's not going to change the composition of the United States. Don't worry, American
Wow.
public, is essentially what he was trying to say. But then something interesting happened. For the first time, there was a special category that was included in this where there's an expedited entry of people who were, and I'm going to hopefully get most of the quote right, but aliens seeking to enter the country when there are not enough workers in the United States. So there's a
Right, okay.
special subsection in this piece of legislation that, hey, it's not going to do much. It's really all about the geopolitical stage. But we're going to have this caveat for if there's a shortage of labor, and especially of particular kinds of skilled labor, so of scientists, of engineers, of physicians, you are welcome to come.
Hmm.
And in fact, you're invited to come to the United States because part of the Cold War, so much of the Cold War was fought through this realm of knowledge, and
Yeah.
science and medicine were crucial sites for that. This is why you get things like moon landings and stuff
Yeah.
happen during this period of time. And so the US had this deficiency of physicians that I we talked about earlier in the history of why that was, but it had to also it didn't want to broadcast that deficiency
Mhm.
on the national stage. And so this piece of legislation became a way of doing this geopolitical work, but also of quickly supplementing the domestic labor force as well by creating this special category of skilled migration
Hmm.
that could quickly enter the country.
And so, this exists and, people start to hear about it, they start to see opportunity, but I'm curious why specifically because you would think then that there would be, like, an influx of immigration from all over the world, but that's not really what happened.
Yeah, so this is where, again, we're touting the strengths of history, and this is where it comes in really handy because the majority of people that were coming to the United States were from the Philippines, were from India, and were from Pakistan.
Mm.
And the reason why that was the case was because of colonial legacies. So the Philippines, the US colonized until 1946. And one of the main avenues through which they asserted dominance and restructured the society there was through establishing these kinds of Western biomedical institutions. And so that really facilitated the movement of people from the Philippines to the United States, and especially the nursing force, which was even greater than the physician force during
Really? Oh, that's
this
interesting. I don't
time.
think we often hear about that.
Huge, huge Filipino nurses, yeah.
Mm,
And then the British colonization of South Asia really created this kind of flow of people. So, the subcontinent was considered to be the crown jewel of the British Empire, and part of that was this real investment in the establishment of these kinds of institutions of knowledge. And they benefited quite a bit because the NHS is so heavily dominated by South Asian physicians who
mm,
do a lot of the work that I talk about in my book, but started it a little bit earlier. But so it's because these schools were established during these colonial regimes. And in addition, education was happening in English. So
mm,
there's a
mhm,
reason why Chinese physicians who have the education base, but they don't have the fluency in English, find it
mm,
more difficult to come to the United States. And then soon after that, Nigerian physicians also became a really integral component, again, because of British colonization of Nigeria. So it's really these colonial legacies that are structuring these current flows of people.
mhm. Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah, I can imagine that even today there must be some sort of, English fluency or proficiency standard, for a physician's license to transfer here to the United States.
Yes, part of their initial exam, they have to take a biomedical component of multiple choice, what is a cell, et cetera. And then they have an English component. So that's the first step of their possible entry into the United States. And
Mm,
a lot of people from other parts of the world find it difficult just because they've learned in a different language.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, yeah, that would probably be the hardest part.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like, you can be super brilliant in your field and still not be a good language learner, that's for sure, especially
Yeah.
if you're older and, yeah, you haven't really been exposed.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so then this takes us to basically what year are we at now in history, or what era are we at where we're starting to see this kind of new influx?
So we're still, so post 1965, in the first 10 years of this legislation being passed, about 75,000 immigrant physicians came to the
Okay.
United States. That is a massive number. There's times where 46% of the physicians in New York and New Jersey were immigrant physicians during this period of time.
Oh, wow.
And they are fully working in these under resourced hospitals all across the United States, like I said, especially they start off in cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, and then they start to move into more rural communities and then into the West Coast, into Texas, et cetera. So we're in that initial period where there's just this huge influx of labor that is coming, and the United States is kind of grappling with how to make sense of all of the education of the world, essentially,
Mhm.
and how to actually standardize it, and what tools and techniques and bureaucratic procedures should they use to figure stuff out. And it's really just kind of wrestling with that, and it's super haphazard at this period of time. But nevertheless, you have the influx and you have people who are doing the work.
And so, were there any changes then between then and now, or is this what is, like, fully responsible for the composition of physicians that we see now?
There have been some kinds of attempts at limiting the influx of physicians during the 1980s, when there were calls, when the United States was in an economic recession, and when there was medical inflation because the cost of healthcare was going up a lot. So there were some attempts at curbing the flow of physicians from elsewhere,
Mhm.
as if they were part of what was causing the problem. But
Mm.
in fact, that was just not the case, because over and over again, what became apparent was that these physicians are working in what are designated as shortage area communities. And those communities are places where there's a one physician to 3,500 patient ratio or more.
Jesus.
Yeah. And
That's
there are
impossible. Impossible.
there are a huge, huge number. To date, 77 million people live in shortage areas in the United States right now.
Oh, and it's just going to
Uh,
get worse. Oh, it's just going to get worse. It's so
yeah.
scary. And so I mean, I think something that's important to mention here, or at least to ask about, is that even though there were policies that said, yes, please come here, we need you, that doesn't necessarily mean that many of these people were kind of welcome when they got here, right? Like there was still probably a ton of sort of racial division and a lot of just like negative sentiment.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Especially if we think about that initial moment, and I find it so generative to think with that, where you have, especially that 1965 moment where hospitals are forced to desegregate. So already you have Black patients and white physicians that are interacting in this most intimate and vulnerable space of
Mhm.
the clinical encounter. And then, in addition to that, you're now adding this foreigner who is calling themselves a physician, saying that they're an expert, bringing this knowledge from elsewhere, accented English. So I think there's a lot happening within that clinical encounter in that space.
Right.
And they did have to navigate a lot of the challenges in regards to difference and xenophobia because they were not a known entity at all. I mean, just imagine going to the doctor. I don't know if this is how you feel, but I hate it. I find it, just everything about it, just the extreme vulnerability of your body, of having to change out of your clothes, of all of this stuff that's just, it's so intimate and you're so fragile in that state.
Yeah.
And especially when you're going in and you're unwell. But what is worse than being naked and sick at a
Right.
cold table,
Yeah. You add to that this kind of I'm trying to figure out the most sort of diplomatic way to say this, and I'm sure you have a lot better language than I do, but you add to this the composition of the country, both then and now, persistent now, where you have a lot of entrenched racism in the South and in rural areas, which is the very place where a lot of these doctors end up practicing. So you've got a population of healthcare consumers who are like, I've never met someone like you, and who like might have a lot of preconceived notions against this population of providers who are overworked, underpaid, and trying to interface with people who already don't trust doctors and now don't trust doctors because of the color of their skin.
Yeah. And it was a real challenge from the people that I spoke to that they had to
Mm.
do a lot of work and they had to doctor differently in order
Mm.
to be able to yield an effective therapeutic encounter. So
Wow.
often they would talk about, physicians, they were able to assert their presence, their expertise, their dominance by things like the way you walk and the coat that you're wearing. And there's just an assumed authority and a
Mhm.
deference that's often given by virtue of that position. And so these physicians would say, well, we didn't have access to that. People didn't
Right.
actually think that we were the physicians. And so we would go and we'd try to touch somebody and you'd palpate their stomach and they would freak out and say, why the hell are you touching me? Who are
Mhm.
you?
Yeah.
And so they often talked about the fact that they had to really slow down and they had to really think critically about what kinds of things they were able to do, what kinds of ways they had access to, and what kind of ways that they didn't have access to. And so they often talked about modifying their practices such that they had to spend more time to develop the trust, to establish a relationship with their patients. And when they did, it was excellent. And often, then they would tell their other patients would tell people in their community, this is somebody that's great, and you should go to them, do that. But it was different because I think the work that was involved in doing that kind of social massaging was not something that US trained physicians had to do, that they were granted that authority from the get go by virtue of the fact of their professional status.
Oh, absolutely, and that translates till now. I remember having a rural Indian physician on my show and talking, to him about a book that he wrote about, like, practicing in Texas and what it was like when he first got
Hmm.
there, and so then you get this deeper sort of divide and paradox where the very physicians who are struggling financially are now spending more time with each patient and doing more things that they don't get paid for versus the urban center physician where you get 15 minutes face to face. If you're late, too bad because they've got to move on, you're double booked. And these physicians are they complain about it as well, obviously. Like, they don't want healthcare to work that way, but it's the way that the reimbursement schedules work. And so
Yeah.
it's such an interesting deeper divide that almost you have lower access to healthcare in these rural areas, but when you're lucky enough to get it, there does seem to be this deep connection that people start to make with their doctors, and they're treating their whole family, and they're coming over for dinner, and they, like, know the community in a way that urban physicians just don't. They're just kind of in and out, with each appointment.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the best autobiographies about this was written by Abraham Verghese. It's called My Own Country. And he talks about the 1980s moment. And he came as an immigrant physician to Appalachia. And
Mm,
that was a place where there was high incidence of AIDS. People didn't really know what was happening with the disease yet. Early 80s, unclear transmission and
mhm,
symptoms and all of this kind of stuff. And what he said was in that book is that especially gay men were much more willing to come to him to talk about this because he was on the outside, because
right.
he was foreign to the community, because there's so much stigma around just being gay and then around potentially having this disease, that he became this interesting site of resource for people who consider themselves to be on the margins of society, that he on the margins of a profession, they had this kind of alignment. So I think you end up seeing these really interesting allegiances and alliances that form between people that are unexpected, but are about, this person is there and they have this knowledge and they are providing the care.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's such a yeah, it's such an interesting sort of juxtaposition because on the one hand, there's this deeper distrust, and then on the other hand, well, I guess that would make sense, right? Somebody works so much
Mhm.
more to gain one's trust that ultimately, hopefully, it does blossom into a more trusting relationship.
Yeah.
I wonder how it ultimately does affect sensibilities in places like the South or in rural America. I wonder how that feeds into, uh, kind of xenophobia or racist sentiment, if it lessens it or if it is an example, which we often see of the sort of, what's the word? There's a word that's used for it, like the ideal immigrant or the,
The
uh
model minority.
yeah, the
Yeah.
model minority. Yeah, where people go, "Oh, yeah, but they're an exception to the rule."
And I think this is the danger, is that I
Mhm.
think often, and it continues to be the case, where physicians are deemed to be an exception.
Mhm.
In the recent immigration H-1B issue, there's all these lobbying groups, 56 of them, from the American Medical Association to all of the various specialty associations, that are trying to lobby Christy Nome to make an exception for physicians for
Mm.
the H-1B visa fee that went up to $100,000 per sponsorship. And so I think this is the danger of having this cohort of immigrants be this exception when in fact they're a part of a larger spectrum of immigrants who are absolutely foundational to the workings of this country. They're not exceptional, they're foundational, they're fundamental. And that's one of the things that I continually want to draw out with my work in a lot of these conversations, that nobody is stealing anybody else's job. These are
Yeah.
people who are enabling the world that we live in.
Absolutely, and this I think this normalization and humanization of individuals who are in high demand, sometimes high pay, but not always high pay, and I guess high academic achievement positions. Like, your physician is not somehow better than you because of this. They're not somehow more elite. This person isn't somehow more imbued with I don't know, potential. They just did a lot of work. And I think that's the important thing to remember is people who even, PhDs, MDs, people with advanced degrees, there's a lucky factor. There's a huge lucky factor, right? Like we
Yeah,
are privileged to have been
totally.
able to go to school where and when we did. And then we just did a lot of work, but
Yeah,
like we weren't somehow, I don't know, born with some elevated status. I mean, yes, obviously there's a lot of nepotism out there, but even those people who got there, uh, who are in the positions they are by virtue of their skin color and their family's last name and their bank accounts, they're not better, right? They just had
yeah,
more opportunity. It's like
yeah,
it's so important to like meet a scientist, or to like
yeah.
know a physician because then it's like, oh yeah, that's a person.
Yeah, but and I think this is one of the dangers, though, of what's happening just politically, which is that I agree. I grew up in Chicago, went to public school, grew up very poor, was able to take advantage of the fact that there were these kinds of public infrastructural resources
Hmm.
that allowed me to get certain privileges in my education and things, but it was all within the public domain.
Yeah. Yeah, they're
And
there,
as
but culturally, you and I were told we can do it, and that's a
Yeah,
big difference. Yeah.
absolutely. So it's like you have it, and then you have people who are pushing you to say you can use this thing.
Mhm.
And I think now we're reaching this place where we don't even have it anymore.
Yeah, that's
Like it's
true.
being totally gut all of this science and math education. And so then how are you going to produce, you can encourage people, but if they can't get biology in high school, what are they going to do?
Oh, completely, and it really does make you wonder if this sort of intentional, um, molding of public policy, whether you wanna call it this, like, Project 2025 or, like, all these different, the moral majority, like, these effects of decades of pushing for these policies. Is the end goal Lysenkoism? Like, is the end goal just a drain of intellect in our country and an intentional power vacuum so that authoritarian figures can say this is the way? I mean, it just feels sometimes like they didn't think it through, like what's going to happen downstream. But then it makes you get a little bit like, oh, maybe they did think it through. Maybe this is
Yeah,
what they
no.
want. And it's so terrifying because the talent, and again, I don't even like to use that word, the potential is there. There's
Yeah.
so many bright, curious, hardworking, naturally questioning, and also even if they're not naturally questioning, just minds that are ready
Cultivate
for
that.
this. Yeah,
Yeah.
cultivated, and but they have to. It's nature and nurture, right? It's biopsychosocial, and without those components there, they're not going to thrive. They're going to wither, and we're starting to see that now.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. And thinking about the case of the immigrant physicians, and I end with thinking about what are the possibilities of changing the way that labor is structured in the United States. And
Mm.
all of these studies show that when people come from certain communities, so whether these, especially these shortage area communities, they're much more willing to go back and work there as
Mhm.
physicians. So if we know that and the data is showing that, then to exactly the point that you just made, how do you take that information and how do you identify the people who have this interest and this desire and push them and support them such that they will actually just want to naturally go back and work in the communities that they came from and be able to support the populations that have nurtured their growth.
Yeah. And we've had projects like this in the past, haven't we? Like, I know that there were projects in New York City, I remember reading about, I mean, more with academia or education, but I think we've seen this with healthcare as well, where, okay, there's some government system or a program, a grant or something that'll help reimburse your college expenses if you spend, a certain number of years working in these rural communities or teaching in these low income schools. Or, I mean, it's not that difficult, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that they definitely exist, but unless there are other kinds of factors, like the cost is so prohibitive.
Oh
So,
yeah.
like you said, the loan stuff, unless those things are happening in addition, it's going to be really hard, especially because, one of the issues that we face in this country is a primary care shortage, and that's
Hmm.
internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics, the least lucrative professions.
Hmm.
But the most important, that is the backbone of the healthcare system. Those are the frontline people who are doing the work so that you don't get to stage 4 cancer and have to go into these extreme expensive therapies and stuff, right?
Yeah.
They're doing the prevention work. They're doing the daily knowledge of people work.
Yeah.
And and yet again, we have this problem is like if this cost of medical education is too high, which it is, people are going to go into the specialties where they can recoup their cost the fastest.
Yeah.
Those are going to be derm, those are going to be radiology, anesthesiology, surgery, et cetera. And those are not the ones that are going to change the health outcomes for
No, we're going to
millions
specialize
and millions
ourselves
of people.
out of existence, out of health, really.
Yeah,
Like, and we're
yeah.
already starting to see it. Like, a lot of people just can't navigate the healthcare system at all. If they're lucky enough to have a primary care physician, they still struggle to, oh, I've got to see an OBGYN, and I've also got to see my neurologist and my dermatologist. Oh, and I need to go over here and see my orthopedist. And, a lot of people just give up.
Yeah,
They just go,
because
okay,
it's
I just
not
won't
a
treat that thing.
system.
Yeah.
This is the thing is that, when you have a nationalized health system, you actually have a system. It might be inefficient, it might be slow, but there is some kind of organizational logic to it.
Hmm.
We don't
Yeah.
have that. So.
No, and I really hope that people more and more catch on to the fact that, I think we have been duped in this country into believing that one day we're all going to be rich. And so all of these things aren't going to apply to us, and we'll be able to be the ones who take advantage of the quote, system was built or
Yeah.
exists now to benefit those who can just pay their way into, access. And I think that the biggest lie that Americans were fed is that one day you too will be that person at the top. And my hope is that millennials, Gen Zers, and the younger generation are starting to see, because of the percentage of wealth that they actually have access to and how little that wealth purchases for them, that's a lie. That's a sham. And what we need is something that benefits all, not just those who have the means, because you are much closer to being unhoused than you are to being a billionaire. Everybody listening
Absolutely.
to this recording is much closer to being
Yeah.
unhoused than to being a billionaire.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And we're same thing with when it comes to healthcare.
Hmm.
That is something that we're so everybody at any moment can fall into, and to think about creating a system that can actually do the work of caring for that possibility that everybody has is something that we're so far from in this country.
And so I'm curious, as we're kind of finishing up the conversation, I'm curious about, the book, which is so important. It's here. It's when does it drop again? I think
it
it's
it did last
it did already.
October
Okay, good.
14th. Yeah.
Oh, good, good, good. So as of this recording, you can already access it.
Hmm.
Uh Obviously, this is a great, not just an interesting read and one that helps us understand our own history, but informs where we are right now and where we could go. But I'm also curious, as an academic, right? Like, we didn't really talk about what it is to be a historian, to dig into archives and to do the actual work that you do. But you also teach, right? I'm curious
Hmm.
what sort of the topics are. How does I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, how does history for you relate to the present and the future? And is that always a driving force for you? Are you always talking about, we need to know this because look where we're heading?
Yeah, it is a really important driving force. I see history as it's an argument and it's an interpretive frame that
Hmm.
we need for our present. And it can change. And so, in teaching, I tell my students there are a lot of ways that you can construct an argument about the past. I can't tell you with any sort of certainty what happened on Tuesday, February 16th, 1910 at 3:27, nor do I want
Hmm.
to. But what I can do is think about how do I organize a persuasive argument that does work for me in the present in understanding the ways that my world is organized. And so to me, it's a very active process about just situating ourselves in the world and trying to make better sense of that. And it can go in a lot of ways, and we can try on many different versions of this story, and see what fits, what feels like it resonates, what feels like it gives you a more persuasive argument. But at the end of the
Hmm.
day, it is an argument about making sense of our present, just like we use all sorts of other interpretive frames to understand what's happening around us. This is one of those tools to do that.
And it's such an important tool right now, and I'm, it's hard to maintain hope right now, and it's hard not to fall into cynicism, but one of the things that often gives me hope is the uptick in the numbers of, like, books that are being purchased and podcasts that are, launching, and and so much media about our history. Like, there are people right now who are like, I need to read up on authoritarianism. Like, I need to
Yeah.
kind of see what happened before. They're starting to recognize the importance of understanding history because we I think for a while we were smooth sailing and we had blips, but right now more and more people are going, I think I'm living in history. This
Yeah, I think,
this is a time that people are going to be learning about in the future.
but also I think we see how different arguments about history get recruited for contemporary political projects. So, how does an argument
Yes.
about history change even what happens in the Smithsonian to make arguments about what the United States should be today? I think
Mhm.
that's the thing that I always try to instill in my students and just generally is that this is all about an argument for the present, and this is the evidence that gets recruited to make that argument.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, now more than ever, I mean, just look at what our current administration is trying to do in the Smithsonian. Look at what,
Mhm.
look at these overt kind of quiet part out loud conversations that are being had about how we relate to our history and what's going to be suppressed and what's going to be exposed. Um, uh, uh, it's just an extreme example of
Mhm.
everything you've been saying. It's no different than what we've always done, but it's just done in such a way that makes it so overt. Um, and that's important to recognize.
Yeah, it's the scale and the violence associated with it that make it especially urgent in our moment.
Absolutely. Gosh, I could talk to you, Eram, all day long. Like, I cannot wait for your next book to come out because I want to have you back on to talk about it. This was thrilling. It was fascinating. The book is incredible, everybody. It's called The Care of Foreigners: How Immigrant Physicians Changed U.S. Healthcare. And I do hope you'll join us again.
I would love to. Thank you so much for this. It was lovely. It was like I was talking to a friend that I've known forever. So
Oh,
thank
I'm
you.
I'm so glad to hear it. Gosh, and everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.